All right, here we are again. Only two of these left. No, it's tragic. I'm going to try to keep this one under 3 hours. This is Unit 8, one of two units in the 20th and 21st centuries. And this one is 20th century global conflicts. You have covered a lot of this stuff in not just world history freshman year, but also last year in US 2. So we're going to try to hit things, obviously, from a European perspective. Also going to try to go into some details that are course specific and exam specific. And I'm going to try to limit it to that because I don't want this to get out of control, because pretty much each one of these slides could be a college course. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. There's a lot of stuff here. Just like I did last time with the last guided lecture, I thought it would be useful to take the unit at a glance from the AP Euro curriculum and just put it up on the screen so you can see what's going on. There are 11 topics. We'll only really cover 9 of them directly because they always start and end with these skill-based topics. And when you look at the 9 that are content-based, you can really categorize them into 3 broad topics, which is World War I, what I call interwar turmoil, and World War II. There's obviously some other things in there, but they can each be categorized into one of those 3. And interestingly, the interwar period is what receives the most attention in this unit. 8.3, sort of, through 8.7 is all interwar period. World War I just gets 1. World War II gets 2, if you consider the Holocaust as a part of World War II. The interwar period, the College Board is telling us, is very important. And that's because there's a lot of developments in there that lead to World War II. So that's how we will cover it. So a little bit of context here. Just coming out of the last time period, we need to think about contextualizing these 20th century global conflicts. 19th century, lots of political instability and competition in Europe. By the late 19th century, there's political instability, I should say. The unification of Italy and Germany is really going to be a big part of this. There's actually a school of thought among historians that this 100 years is relatively peaceful in Europe, 1815 to 1914, and it is. But there's also a lot of unease and growing tension when we get to the 1870s and 1880s. The Concert of Europe was this attempt that came out of the Congress of Vienna to solve issues diplomatically rather than through military means, through war. It was met with mixed success, I think we could say. And with the unification of Italy and Germany, the Concert of Europe is really thrown out of whack. It's thrown off kilter because the balance of power is fundamentally upset when that happens. And then the third thing we need to look at here in contextualizing this is imperialism. With the rise of the German Empire especially, imperialism and the imperial quest for lands is not just going to be an extra-European affair, meaning outside of Europe. It's going to lead to conflict between and among European countries. The thought process is that maybe imperialism can be almost a release valve, a let-off valve for the tensions in Europe. And this lasts for a little time, maybe 30 or so years. But by the early 1900s, imperialism and the competition that it has wrought on Europe is problematic in Europe. Nationalism, obviously, we've talked about it since the French Revolution, but nationalism is also affecting what you are seeing on the map here. This is 1871, and the quest for self-determination and that process that is still playing out across Europe throughout the middle to late 19th century and into the 20th century. Also, the coming of modernity and the idea that things are changing rapidly post-industrialization, really post-industrialization. By the time we get to the second half of the 19th century, there are new ways of thinking. There are new ways of conceptualizing society. We looked at some of those in the last unit. And then there are also scientific and technological advancements that are beginning to fundamentally change the relationship that people have with the planet and with each other. And that's going to cause more chaos, more uncertainty. And as we'll see, and as you probably know, it's also going to cause more destruction with the outbreak of both of these wars. Lastly, demographic changes across Europe throughout the 19th century. Massive migrations are happening. Lots of people are leaving Europe. Roughly 50 million people are leaving Europe, most of them bound for the United States. But there's also a lot of movement within Europe, within these empires, as these empires coalesce, as these empires chop off land and annex it, and land is exchanged. There's people who are moving when all of that is happening. So the majority of the demographic changes are probably leaving Europe, but there is still internal migration that we do need to consider. With both World War I and World War II on the AP Euro curriculum, the causes and effects are what are most important. Military history is sort of the the unwanted stepchild of the historical academic world in some ways. Military historians often feel themselves pushed to the side by other academic historians, and there's a decent amount of truth to that. Military history is seen as a niche subject, and the AP Euro exam is going to reflect that. There's not going to be a lot of military history, if any. So things like battles and campaigns, that stuff is not going to show up on the exam. Causes and effects are what the College Board is saying are most important for you guys to know. World War I causes are in some ways more complex than World War II, but in other ways easier for us to take a look at. If you remember from world history or maybe even US 2 last year, the causes can be best summed up by this acronym: MAIN, M-A-I-N, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. I'm not going to go over this in too much detail. That's why I put the infographic up there, which I think does a nice job of explaining each of those. Feel free to pause it and write some of that stuff down, but we've covered all of this so extensively, especially imperialism and nationalism, that it should be pretty obvious at this point. Militarism, with the rise of Germany especially, militaries are beginning to exert more political control in European countries. We see this in other countries as well, like Japan, but we're just talking about Europe here. And alliances are formed throughout the second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century as a way for countries to defend themselves in the event of a wider conflict. So beyond these long-term causes, we need to look at the short-term causes of World War I, and they can really be found in the first 10 to 15 years of the 20th century. The Moroccan crises, there are two of them in 1905 and 1911. Germany is stirring up both of these. Germany is a rival of France and has been for quite some time, going back to Napoleon and before. And Morocco is a French colony in northern Africa. Germany is interested in weakening France, and so what better way than to stir up and support rebellions? In 1905, the Kaiser visits Morocco and makes a speech where he supports Moroccan independence, which the French are none too happy about. And in 1911, during a rebellion that the French are trying to put down in Morocco, the Germans actually land an armored ship in a Moroccan port. The 1911 crisis really gets France and Germany close to war, but war is averted. But it is clear by this point, 1911, that tensions are really, really high. Another area, of course, is the Balkans. The Balkans is this area that historically was controlled by the Ottoman Empire for about 200 years. The Ottoman Empire is weakening into the 19th century, and so the Balkans is what we can refer to as a power vacuum, as a political power vacuum. Austria-Hungary is attempting to fill that power vacuum, as is Russia. And a third group, which are Slavic nationalists, people who do not want the Balkans to be under the control of any empire, be it Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, or even the Russians, who style themselves as a Slavic empire. So when we talk about the short-term causes, this is what we're looking at, and I think will we come back to those? Yeah. We'll come back to those. Okay, I thought I had a couple more. I just wanted to make sure. So talking about alliances, I don't know why I have this here. This is kind of out of order. I probably should have put this before. This was meant to go after long-term causes, so apologies there. So pre-war. 1914, those are what our alliances look like. On the left, you have the Central Powers. Actually, it's called the Triple Alliance. It's not really the Central Powers, technically, because Italy is not going to join the Central Powers when the war breaks out. Italy stays neutral. But we have these two camps. We have the Triple Alliance in the middle, and then we have the Triple Entente, bookmarking them, or bookending them, I should say. When the war breaks out on the right, I mentioned Italy is going to stay out of the war initially, but in 1915, it's actually going to come into the war on the side of the Allies. And then we have the Central Powers, called as such because the two most powerful are in the center of Germany. There's Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire as well, but they are lesser powers for sure. And then the Allies, the big ones there are the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. All the others are fairly minor, even Italy. And the United States will be an allied power as well, but not until 1917, April of 1917. The U.S. is going to enter the war. Oh, right, that's why. Okay, effects. Gosh, my brain is not working tonight. Apologies. So the effects of World War I. This is the first global war. Obviously, it's World War I, called at the time the Great War, or the War to End All Wars. It wasn't called World War I at the time. That would have been a pretty pessimistic view on it, planning for a second. It was the first global war. It's going to be global because the United States gets involved. It's going to be global because the British European colonies, get involved. It's going to be global because Japan and China have minor roles to play. So it is truly a global war. It's mostly a European affair. It's going to be less global than World War II, but it is a global war. It's also really the first total war that we're going to see in Europe. When we talk about total war, we mean the total mobilization of societies that are fighting the war. Historically, wars were fought by armies, and if your army went off to fight a war and off to battle, and you were sitting at home in your country, you may not have felt many of the effects of the war. If the fighting was taking place elsewhere, manufacturing didn't really have to change too much for the war. Rationing probably didn't have to happen too much for the war. Now, all of a sudden, societies are completely mobilizing for the war. And so what we see are massive economic commitments and economic shifts, but we also begin to see a massive uptick in deaths as well. In World War I, we have roughly 15 to 22 million deaths, of which about half of those are civilians. We're going to see more death in World War II, and we're actually going to see more civilian death in World War II. But at the time, this was catastrophic to Europeans. They had never experienced anything like this amount of death in any conflict ever. You think about the Napoleonic Wars and how Napoleon swept across Europe. They paled in comparison to what we see in World War I, and that's in large part due to the technology of the war. The technology is primarily defensive, which makes the war so difficult to win. And it is also what makes the war so deadly, because the commanders on both sides of the war cannot figure out how to win the war. And so they just throw men at these defensive technologies, things like machine guns, things like artillery, things like trenches and barbed wire. And so we see these multi-month long sieges and battles like the Battle of the Somme and Verdun and the Gallipoli campaign that result in hundreds of thousands of casualties. It's, like I said, it's catastrophic. The old order is eventually destroyed coming out of World War I. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in 8.4, so I'm not going to talk about it here. But what World War I does is it tears down the old order. And what World War I doesn't do is it doesn't replace it with anything. And that's the big problem coming out of World War I. So that, to me, is the important stuff as far as the College Board is concerned. You could take a college class on World War I. So to sum it up in one slide is almost laughable. But I think this is the key stuff for the exam. Now, during World War I, the Russian Revolution begins. And similarly to World War I and World War II, we're really going to focus on causes and effects here. This is another topic that has garnered massive amounts of interest over the years, over the century, I guess, since it happened. And it's another one that could be its own class in college. So we're going to try to do it in one slide, but it's fairly dense. So long-term causes. Russia's got a lot of problems. Russia is a country that has really stagnated and is very far behind the West of Europe by the mid-19th century. It is trying its best. The czars are trying their best to pull Russia into the industrial age, but it is halting progress at best. And so there is political stagnation in the form of the Romanov dynasty, which has been on the Russian throne since the early 1600s. And there is also technological stagnation as well. Russia is massive. Russia's great benefit is that it has all of this land with these resources. But in the industrial age, this is also a detriment because Russia has to try to figure out how to harness this, how to build the Trans-Siberian Railway, a railway that is 6,000 miles long. Traversing these things is very, very difficult for Russia. So it's a primarily agricultural society, and it's going to take time for Russia to catch up to the West in terms of technology. Tsarist repression, similar to political stagnation, but the czars are pretty repressive in terms of political dissent and in terms of how they are dealing with political dissent, especially in the late 19th century. There's some dynastic rubber banding here that's going on. There are some czars that are a little bit more reform-minded. There are other czars that are more repressive. What we need to know about the czars really is that compared to certainly democratic standards, they are very repressive. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, these are not really the things that the czars are interested in. And indeed, they are going to use military tactics to make sure they don't happen in Russia. So World War I exacerbates these problems for Russia. World War I is very bad for Russia. World War II is going to be worse, but World War I is very bad for Russia. Millions are going to be casualties of this war. And by the time we get to 1916 and 1917, the problems on the home front for Russia are going to be acute. Workers are going to be fed up with working extremely long hours, really working until they break for the war effort. And peasants are going to be upset, and the workers as well, that they are not getting enough food. Bread prices are rising. The food is being prioritized for the military that is fighting the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans. And so you have these two issues that are occurring on the home front. The workers are angry and the people are starving. The people are struggling to survive. So we have two revolutions in 1917. We have the February Revolution in 1917, and in this revolution, the Tsar Nicholas II abdicates, steps down from the throne. He is replaced by a provisional or a temporary government. Now, the provisional government makes a key decision, and that decision is that they will continue to fight the war. They say they will honor their obligations to the Allies, and they continue to fight the war. This does not go over well with many in Russia, and certainly the radical left, who want an end to the war at all costs. And so we get a second revolution in October of 1917. And this is the more famous. When people talk about the Russian Revolution, they're talking about the Bolshevik Revolution of October of 1917. This is the one that ushers in communism. Probably air quotes around that. It's very different than what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had in mind, but it is going to be the first experiment in regards to a capitalist state in the world. This is not the end of the story, however. The October Revolution is pretty much bloodless. It's a political revolution where the Bolsheviks take power from the provisional government. But what happens afterwards for the next 7 years is very bloody indeed, and that is the Russian Civil War. Russia comes right out of World War I and goes right into 7 years of civil war. This war is going to pit the whites, who are the supporters of, they're kind of So there are some supporters of the Tsar. There are some supporters of the provisional government. There are supporters of just a more democratic ideal than what the Bolsheviks have in mind. The Reds and the Red Army are the ones who are supporting the Bolsheviks and want a communist revolution. Eventually, the Red Army is going to prevail despite the best efforts of the Whites, who were aided by the United States. The White Army was aided by the United States. And there was actually there was a group of U.S. soldiers who were involved in the war. I think they were called the Polar Bears. I think that was their nickname. You can look that up and tell me if I'm right or wrong. I think I heard that on Jeopardy the other week. The United States was officially neutral. These were people who were volunteers, but there were Americans who were fighting on the side of the Whites. So the Red Army prevails, communism prevails, and the Soviet Union begins its attempt at carving out a communist state, an attempt which will last for a little over 70 years until early 1990s when it collapses. The new economic policy is a term that the College Board throws in the curriculum, and it's something that you should know. What happens is that during the Russian Civil War, there's something called war communism that is put in place where the Soviet government takes control of the means of production. So pretty rapidly, it looks like a socialist communist takeover in full force is occurring. But after the war, Lenin reverses course, and he creates what is called the new economic policy, which is summed up as free market solutions to bring about communism. The problem for the Bolsheviks and Lenin, as they see it, is that communism is supposed to be the stage after full capitalist industrialization takes place. This is what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels theorized, that capitalism is eventually going to pass into communism. What the Bolsheviks realize is that Russia has barely passed into capitalism and industrialization, and so they have to get through that stage. And the best way they can do it is the free market. It's the most tested and tried and true way. And so that's the new economic policy. That's going to last until 1928, when Joseph Stalin replaces Vladimir Lenin after a power struggle and reverses the new economic policy in favor of collectivization of agriculture and rapid industrialization. More, quote unquote, socialist or communist looking economic policy is what Stalin is going to try to bring about. He implements a series of 5-year plans. These 5-year plans are plans by the government to achieve these goals, to rapidly catch the Soviet Union up through socialist means, not through free market means, but through socialist means. So both Lenin and Stalin recognize the problem facing the Soviet Union is primarily industrialization, but they go about it in different ways. So that's the Russian Revolution. Both of them. All right, 8.4, Paris Peace Conference. After World War I, the victors convene in Paris in 1919 for 6 months in the summer. The conference is actually going to drag on for years as the Allies are crafting these treaties. There's a series of treaties that are crafted, but the major settlements are hammered out in the spring and summer of 1919 in Paris. And what we see are two camps. There are the idealists led by Woodrow Wilson, the United States president, and there are, I guess we could call them the realists, who want to punish Germany, led by France, George Clemenceau, and Britain, David Lloyd George. What we see is a piece of compromise in some ways, but it's mostly a piece of revenge. Woodrow Wilson gets his League of Nations, which is created in 1920, is going to last to roughly the outbreak of World War II. I think it might technically last past 1939, but it's all but dissolved by 1939. The League of Nations, the big problem, which you know from U.S. history, is that the United States never joins, and the United States was the one who wanted it in the first place. The other issue with the League of Nations is that it is weak. It's deliberately created to be weak. Second, multiple treaties are signed. There are treaties with each of the Central Powers. Most crucial of these is the Treaty of Versailles, which is the treaty between the Allies and Germany. Real quick, because this is like the third time you guys have covered this, but the Treaty of Versailles does all these things. It creates the Weimar Republic, which is a weak, ineffective government in Germany. It's a democratic government. It is set up to be weak. France wants a weak German government. They don't want to deal with Germany anymore. They don't want any more German invasions. Reparations, exorbitantly high. Germany is made to pay for the entire war. Limitations on German armed forces. These are very severe limitations. The army is capped at 100,000, which sounds like a lot, but for a country like Germany, which had mobilized millions and millions of soldiers during World War I, it's not a lot. They were capped at no air force. They could not have an air force. Their naval force was also extremely limited. It was something like 10 capital ships or something. The limitations are extreme. And the war guilt clause, which really angers the German people. They do not feel like this war was their fault. They feel like they were dragged into the war by Austria-Hungary and by Russian mobilization. The other thing that I don't really have up on here, but Germany feels like it didn't lose the war. Germany feels like they went to the Allies and said, hey, let's call a truce. No German land had been fought on. No foreign troops had made their way into Germany. And so for Germany all of a sudden to be handed this treaty with extremely harsh terms, and the Allies essentially say to Germany, you will either accept these terms or we're going to resume the war. The Germans didn't feel that was fair at all. And this is going to breed a great amount of resentment, which is going to come back in the 1930s in the lead up to World War II. Another outcome at Paris in 1919 is the carving up of old empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, gone, carved up into Austria and Hungary. The German Empire, gone. It's just, the Weimar Republic. It's the German Republic. And Germany loses a big chunk of land out in Eastern Europe. The Russian Empire is gone, replaced by the Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire is gone, replaced by Turkey. And some League mandates, which are nice, fancy ways to say colonies. What to do with the old Ottoman lands in the Middle East, we'll call them League mandates. They are, in essence, colonies of the British. And speaking of colonies, one of the things that many colonial peoples had hoped would come out of World War I was self-determination and maybe even decolonization. After all, Woodrow Wilson had worked this into his 14 points. And so in Paris in 1919, we don't only see the major victors of World War I who are meeting. We see representatives from over 50 colonies and other smaller countries who have come to Paris to lobby for their independence and their freedom and their self-determination. That will be delayed. They will be shut out of the negotiations and they will be disappointed. This will eventually come about after World War II, but even then, it is delayed. And I would argue it's still a process that's going on, decolonization. So what do we need to know? I think you know. This is a piece of revenge. In hindsight, looking back and reflecting, it is a massive failure. The goal of any peace should be to create a lasting peace, a peace that can last and stand the test of time. Versailles does absolutely the opposite. It creates a temporary peace and a peace that actually antagonizes many, many countries leading into World War II. So continuing with our interwar years, the global economic crisis, again, kind of quickly through this because there's some A-push stuff in here. Begins in 1929 in the United States, spreads quickly. Germany had been experiencing some economic problems in the mid-1920s. They were unrelated to the global economic collapse that is going to happen in 1929 and into the 1930s. The United States is the largest economy in the world by 1900, and they are incredibly important for global trade. In A-Push, we talk about this idea of isolationism prior to World War II, and we also delve into that and tear it apart a little bit. The United States is isolated, especially politically, from Europe. We are not isolated economically, and much of the world depends on our industrial economy. So when the U.S. economy collapses in 1929 and 1930, it has knock-on effects around the world. Tariffs are quickly raised, which are taxes on imported goods. They are raised in the United States and all over the world as an effort to protect domestic industries, but they lead to a massive decline in global trade. So you have the most powerful economy, industrial economy in the world collapsing, and at the same time, you are putting up barriers to trade. These two things combined lead to this collapse of global trade. So responses here. The Western democracies, as we would expect, are going to take pretty moderate responses. We're talking about Britain, France, the United States, of course, would be in here. Scandinavia would be in here. They failed to overcome the Depression prior to 1939. The asterisk here and the exception are the Scandinavian countries, which are actually pretty successful. Keynesian economics are going to be attempted in Britain and the United States. This is John Maynard Keynes here up on the slide. He's a British economist. What Keynes argues is that when you have a time of economic recession or depression, private industry is reluctant to hire workers and they're laying off workers. And when this happens, the government needs to step in and become the employer. Keynes argues that the most acute problem in an economic downturn is unemployment. And if unemployment can be solved, the other issues will follow suit. And so Keynes says the government needs to do anything it can, including running up debts, to put people back to work. Britain and the United States are going to try this, the United States with the New Deal, and limited success, as we saw in APUSH. The Depression doesn't really get worse when Keynesian economics begin in 1933 in the United States, but it also doesn't really get too much better. At the outbreak of World War II, these countries are still dealing with well over 10% unemployment. Scandinavia is doing something called cooperative social action, which is sort of like moderate socialism. I mean, this is like the welfare state. The Scandinavian countries are the first to completely recover from the Depression. They're actually going to recover in the late 1930s. So they have some success. France is going to have a Popular Front government, which is an alliance of left-wing movements, including the Communist Party. There's a Workers' Party. There's a Radical Socialist Party. They are all going to combine to create the Popular Front in 1936. So this is a pretty left-wing liberal government. Again, moderate success. Germany and Italy are going to take a different approach, as is Japan. Radical response to the Depression. Massive public works projects, which we see in other countries in the Western democracies as well. The radical components, which we don't see in the Western democracies, are the extent of militarization and expansionism. Both Germany and Italy are going to kind of look at the problem in a similar way to Keynes. They're going to say, we need to get people back to work. They're just going to do it through militarization, massive public works projects as well, but building up their militaries, putting people to work in military factories. This is what's going to solve the Depression for Britain and the United States, but not until the war begins. Germany and Italy are just doing it in preparation for the war that they are going to start. Expansionism is a component of this then, of course. If you build up your military, you got to use it. And so Germany and Italy are both going to expand in the late 1930s. Italy into Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, and Germany, of course, into the Rhineland and Austria and Czechoslovakia, and eventually Poland, which will kick off the war. So that's the global economic crisis. Here for the AP Euro exam, we're really looking at causes and responses. So not necessarily effects. The effects are pretty obvious in some ways, but more just how European countries respond and what those outcomes are. Are those effects? Yeah, kind of, I guess. Whew, all right, we're more than halfway done. My goodness, I got to keep it under an hour. That's my goal. Fascism and totalitarianism. There are the definitions right there. You can read, so I won't read them. They're very closely related in some ways. Fascism is more distinct than totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is this broad umbrella that we can put a lot of different political ideologies under. And fascism is one of those political ideologies that we can put under totalitarianism. Soviet communism we can also put, or maybe Stalinist communism, we can put under totalitarianism too. But fascism is distinct. We're talking about a specific ideology that exists in a specific time period, that exists in specific places. And so we can use the word totalitarianism across multiple areas and time periods, but fascism we really can't. I mean, I guess we can, but it's pretty localized to 1920s through 1945. It's going to last in Spain into the 1970s, actually, but it's going to look very different. So it rose in the aftermath of World War I. Fascism is characterized by bitterness, and the bitterness over World War I guess it's not characterized by these things. These are the underlying factors this is the fertile ground for fascism. So the bitterness from World War I, the economic instability that exists in the 20s and 30s, political uncertainty that exists, and the weakness of the Weimar Republic we could put in there, and the rise of communism. The fascists view the communists as their mortal enemies, and the communists view the fascists in a similar way. So you put all this together and you get, like I said, pretty fertile ground for the rise of a radical far-right authoritarian ultranationalism, which is in the definition of fascism up there. Okay, so characteristics: utilized propaganda very effectively, promoted charismatic leaders, Hitler, Mussolini, Francisco Franco in Spain. These are all great examples of fascist leaders. Of course, Hitler is the most common example, and he's a perfect example of all of the stuff that we see up in the definition there. The fascists glorified war and sacrifice for the nation. This goes into the idea of ultranationalism, and yeah, I mean, that's fascism in a nutshell. Another topic that we could spend a lot of time on. The key things for you to know with fascism is really, it's like 1920 to 1945. It's Italy, Germany, and Spain primarily. There are other examples of it, but those are the big three. And it's far right, authoritarian, and ultranationalist. That's the big stuff. That I think if you know that, you're going to be set up well for the exam. Totalitarianism, as I mentioned, the AP curriculum kind of places that in the Soviet Union, but totalitarianism can be seen elsewhere. And indeed, the Nazi state is a totalitarian state. The fascist Italy is a totalitarian state. Japan is a totalitarian state during the 1940s. In the Soviet Union, Stalin is exerting complete control over politics and the economy and social life. He's purging his political rivals. He's liquidating the kulaks, which is the landowning class. He is utilizing Ukraine as like industrial farmland, and he's doing it to the detriment of millions of Ukrainians who are going to die of famine as Stalin is rerouting their resources. Ukraine is referred to as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, or the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. It's an incredibly rich area, and Stalin is going to use it to enrich Russia, basically, and to support the war effort eventually, but really to try to industrialize Russia in the 1930s. He's going to work millions of Ukrainians to death, kick them off their land, those things as well. 8.7, Europe during the interwar period. It's kind of a weird one, right? Because we've been talking about Europe during the interwar period. But I thought the best way to deal with this was timeline. Oh my goodness, there's so much stuff up on the screen. Whew. So this is a great opportunity to pause, to digest. The big ones here, I'll highlight a few of them for you. So 1933 is when Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany. 1934, he takes full and complete power. He was sharing power with the president, Paul von Hindenburg, prior to Hindenburg's death of natural causes. Or was it? No, it was. In August of 1934. So that's when he becomes the complete leader of Germany, the German Führer. We'll talk about the Nuremberg laws, so I'll save that for a little later. 1936, this is when things really start to move. March of 1936, German troops occupy the Rhineland, which was a demilitarized zone set up after World War I. This is the first aggressive act of Germany. It is it's not peaceful. They march troops in, but there are no shots fired. France does not stand in the way of this occupation. So that happens. 2 months later, Mussolini's forces take Ethiopia. Civil war erupts in Spain. These are the big three in 1936. Looking back, this is when we really can see the beginnings of what will become World War II. As these fascist leaders they're testing. They're testing the Allies to see what they can get away with throughout 1936, 37, 38, and 39. And so that's what we're seeing up here. 1938, Germany takes over Austria in the Anschluss. This is another bloodless moment. This is another bloodless, aggressive act, made most famous by The Sound of Music, I think. But Germany just marches in and takes it over. The Australian, I knew I was going to do that. The Austrian government, not the koalas or the kangaroos, the Austrian government invites Nazi Germany under a lot of pressure to take it over. Another big one, September of 1930, the Munich Pact is signed, which is signed between Britain and Adolf Hitler in Munich, Germany. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, gives away the Sudetenland here, which is this piece of Czechoslovakia that was made up of primarily ethnic Germans. And Hitler was like, we want that because they're German. And Britain was like, okay, you can have it, but this is it. This is the last aggressive act. And Hitler was like, yep, sure. And then, that didn't happen because 6 months later, he takes over all of Czechoslovakia. What else? Non-aggression pact is one that comes up from time to time. The Nazis and the Soviets sign a non-aggression pact in August of 1939. They don't trust each other. They don't like each other, but this is mutually beneficial at the time because Germany wants to deal with France and Britain first, and they don't want a war on two fronts like they had in World War I. And the Soviet Union is not prepared for war yet. They're still behind. So that's where the non-aggression pact comes in. A lot of times students look at that and they're like, wait a second, I thought like the fascists and the communists hated each other and didn't trust each other. Yeah, they absolutely did. But this was mutually beneficial for a time. And it's at this point that we get the start of the war. September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invade Poland. 2 days later, Britain, France, and Australia and New Zealand declare war on Germany, and the war is on. Poland is going to fall very quickly in September of 1939. And then for the next 6 months, there will be what's called the Phony War. And the Phony War is this time when countries are mobilizing for war, but like there's no fighting going on. And there's some optimism that maybe the war could be averted, but then, it can't be averted. Blitzkrieg. You've heard Blitzkrieg before. German tactic of rapid conquest using panzer divisions and air support. Germany very quickly masters the continent of Europe with two notable exceptions. Britain, which is an island. I guess it's like multiple islands, but and the Soviet Union, where Germany manages to penetrate pretty far into, but the Soviet Union does hold out against German forces and eventually turns the tide, due once again to the Soviet winter, as well as the massive sacrifices of the Soviet and Russian peoples. The United States enters the war in late 1941, and the tide of the war is turned in 1942. It's turned for two reasons. One, the United States industrial capacity is the most powerful in the world. And once the U.S. economy starts gearing up for war, there is nothing that the Axis powers can do about it. By 1944 and 1945, the United States is outproducing every other country in the war combined. The other thing is that the Soviets make millions of sacrifices. The Battle of Stalingrad, or the Siege of Stalingrad in 1942, is seen as militarily the turning point of the war on the continent of Europe. D-Day is another turning point of the war, but in 1942, Stalingrad is the turning point of the war. The Soviets will not be defeated. Germany will have a war on two fronts, and there will be no easy victory for the Nazis. World War II is also characterized by technological leaps, industrialized warfare, tanks, aircraft. They were around in World War I, but they are much more developed now, and they are going to be used to great destruction. Nuclear weapons, of course, the United States uses two nuclear weapons on Japan, but the development of nuclear weapons is a part of World War II. Characterized by complete total war, massive human toll, military losses 20 to 25 million. This is about the total number of casualties that we saw in World War I. When we look at this number here, we are talking about deaths. And this is just the military. Civilian losses are between 50 and 55 million people. Again, we are talking about deaths. And the Soviet Union is going to suffer almost half of these. Just an incredible 30 years for Russia and the Soviet Union. Between 1914 and 1945, Russia and the Soviet Union is going to lose something like 60 million people. Just incredible. Well, we know this. The Allies win, May of 1945. Europe, Germany is defeated. Italy is defeated before that, but Germany is defeated in May of 1945, and in August of 1945, the war is over in the Pacific. So the Holocaust happens during World War II, but it is often separated out into its own field of studies. And this is because the Holocaust is really separate from World War II. There are some commonalities, of course, but the Holocaust has its roots elsewhere, and the Holocaust begins in many ways before World War II. The Holocaust, I think you know, is the deliberate destruction of 12 million people, 6 million of them Jews. The Jewish population of Europe is going to make up the largest ethnic group that is going to be targeted in the Holocaust, which is why the Holocaust is often associated with the Jews. But we need to remember that there are 6 million other people who come from a variety of other groups that we'll talk about in a moment, who are also systematically destroyed. And that's the thing about the Holocaust. This is systematic. It's industrialized, and it's shocking. Nothing like this had ever been seen before on the scale that the Nazis are doing this. So it's perpetrated by the Nazis. It's fueled by historic anti-Semitism that existed in Europe for thousands of years. And the Nazis are just going to prey on this and use it for their goal of creating a new racial order, purifying the German race and purifying all of Europe, eventually, is the Nazis' goal. The Holocaust is, I say it's a slow road to the Holocaust. I don't want you to think that means I'm diminishing the significance of it. Far from it. But what I mean more is that the Holocaust is not something that happens overnight. It is something that the Nazis slowly implement policies that are more and more discriminatory, more and more extreme, and more destructive. So in 1933, we see the boycott of Jewish businesses. We see various other anti-Semitic laws that are being passed. Jews can't own land. Jews can't own businesses moving forward, those sorts of things. Also in 1933, it's going to become official state policy that Jews should leave, that Jews should emigrate. So the Nazis begin by attempting to push out the Jews, basically just pressuring them to leave. Some Jews do leave, but the majority do not. They don't have the means to leave. They don't have anywhere to go. There are very few countries that are willing to take them in. And also, they don't want to leave. I mean, it's their home, many of these people that we're talking about. They have roots going hundreds, thousands of years back. So it's not just as simple as the Nazis are persecuting us, let's leave, because very few people could have predicted what would have come after this. Concentration camps are opened in 1933, but these are concentration camps that are prison camps. When we talk about concentration camps that are for the deliberate destruction of people, when we're talking about death camps, those camps are going to come later. Those camps are going to be really like 1940, 1941. That's when we're going to start to see the really famous Auschwitz and Treblinka and Bergen-Belsen, these camps that are really about the destruction of people. At first, concentration camps are for prisoners. They're for political prisoners. The Nuremberg Laws are passed in 1935. That showed up on the timeline a couple slides back. The Nuremberg Laws are racial laws. They are laws that define what it means to be a Jew and what it means to be a German. The Nuremberg Laws are important to what the Nazis are attempting to do because the Nuremberg Laws begin this process of categorizing people as Jewish and not Jewish based on blood. And the Nuremberg Laws are also going to make it so that when the Nazis begin the attempted destruction of European Jewry, they have records of the European Jews. They have synagogue rolls. They have European Jews registered. This is when we start to see things like Jews being forced to wear the yellow Star of David in public. Jewish registration really takes hold in 1938, and at the end of 1938 is Kristallnacht, which is the night of broken glass, where the Nazis and Nazi thugs are going to go around Germany smashing Jewish businesses, but primarily Jewish synagogues. It's at this point, this is an inflection point in the Holocaust, because it's at this point that there are many Jews who begin to, who say, this is different. We've dealt with anti-Semitism before, but this is different. This is more extreme than what we have ever done before. And it's at this point that the Jews of Germany begin to try to flee. But for many of them, it's too late because they have nowhere else to go. As I mentioned, nowhere else will take them in. There are other targeted groups that I alluded to: homosexuals, people with disabilities, the Roma, who are sometimes referred to as gypsies. Black Germans are in here as well. Political opponents of the Nazis we could put in here as well. Eastern Europeans we could also put in here as well. The Eastern Europeans, when Germany invades Eastern Europe, Eastern Europeans are seen by the Nazis as inferior, as a subhuman race, and so they are not treated like the French or the Belgians or the Dutch when these places are overtaken. The Nazis see those Western groups as more civilized, and so those occupations, while bad, are not like what we see in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, we see killing squads that are going around. We see the Einsatzgruppen, we see the SS going around and liquidating entire towns. And we can include that in the Holocaust as well. So like I said at the outset, the Holocaust is something that is often lumped in with World War II, but it is also seen as distinct for many of the reasons that I talked about and you see up on the slide there. We made it. Last slide. So 20th century cultural, intellectual, and artistic developments. Kind of an odd one to just shoehorn in here, but I guess the College Board felt they needed to. So much of everything else is just about the wars and destruction and death, and here we have some cultural stuff. But a lot of it is related to the wars, the breakdown of the notion of progress. This is a big one that you should associate with World War I. Before World War I, there were some people in the West especially who believed that the West had cracked the code of civilization and that the West had reached this pinnacle of constant progress, that progress would continue forever. World War I shatters that myth. And so what we see is that after World War I, the confidence in science and technology is really shaken. We see this after World War II as well, where people are questioning nuclear weapons, for example. Like, what does this mean? Like, are we going to destroy the world now? So it's World War I where confidence in science and technology is shaken, but it's also World War II. Mixed in with this, though, we do see scientific progress. Albert Einstein, obviously working during this time period. Niels Bohr, who's pictured here, very influential for physics and quantum mechanics. Werner Heisenberg, same thing there. So there is, there's this like duality that's going on. There's people who are beginning to distrust science, but there's also a lot of scientific advancement that is occurring at the same time. The Lost Generation from World War I, maybe you remember that from APUSH, I'm not sure, but the Lost Generation is used two different ways. The Lost Generation is the generation that is killed in World War I, the millions of young boys, 18 to 25-year-olds who are killed, leaving a lost generation, a generational gap. It's also used as a nickname for the disillusionment and cynicism that we see pervading Western society. The Lost Generation is literary, it's artistic, it's people like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway who are questioning the very foundations of civilization, Western civilization. They're very cynical after World War I. Lastly, we also see the increasing involvement of women in society. Bonus points if you know who this is. During World War II, right here, this is actually Queen Elizabeth, the current one, Queen Elizabeth II. She, during the war, towards the end of the war, 1945, she actually signed up in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. She was a mechanic during World War II. She's learning how to change a tire here. So this is the current Queen of England as of the recording of this. She's 93 years old as of the recording of this, and so she's emblematic of the female involvement that is brought about by both wars, but especially World War II. I could have put like Rosie the Riveter up here, but that's American, so I didn't want to do that. But it's the same across pretty much all the societies that are involved in the war. Women are going to be more involved because the societies need them to be. That's going to lead to women's liberation eventually. It's going to take time, but that's for another day and another unit. Well, I kept it under an hour. I wasn't confident that I was going to be able to do that. I'm going to shut up now because you've listened to me talk for long enough. It's Unit 8.